What happens when a federal judge decides to weaponize live television against the one woman who refuses to bow down? When Judge Miranda Kane stepped onto that CNN set, everyone expected fireworks, but nobody anticipated the nuclear explosion that would follow. Attorney General Sarah Walsh had built her reputation on never backing down from a fight. But this wasn't just any confrontation. This was a calculated ambush designed to destroy her career on national television. As the cameras rolled and millions watched, Kane unleashed a verbal assault so vicious that it left seasoned journalists gasping. But Walsh's response? It didn't just silence the studio, it rewrote the rules of power forever. This wasn't just another political takedown. This was the moment when justice itself hung in the balance, and what happened next shocked even the most cynical observers in Washington. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany-paneled corridors of the Federal District Court of Northern Virginia had witnessed their share of legal drama, but nothing quite prepared the nation for the storm brewing behind Judge Miranda Kane's chambers. For weeks, whispers had circulated through the legal community about the escalating tension between Kane and Attorney General Sarah Walsh, two titans of the justice system whose philosophical differences had slowly transformed into something far more personal and dangerous. Judge Kane, appointed during the previous administration, had built her reputation on what supporters called judicial restraint and critics termed judicial activism in reverse. Her rulings consistently favored government authority over individual rights, and her courtroom demeanor suggested someone who believed that questioning federal power was tantamount to treason. At 58, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had never been told no. Her silver hair always perfectly coiffed, her black robes worn like armor against any challenge to her authority. Attorney General Sarah Walsh represented everything Kane despised about the current administration. Young, brilliant, and uncompromisingly principled, Walsh had earned her position through a combination of prosecutorial excellence and an unwavering commitment to constitutional law that often put her at odds with both political parties. At 42, she possessed the rare combination of legal acumen and moral courage that made her simultaneously admired and feared throughout Washington. Her rise from assistant district attorney in Phoenix to the nation's top law enforcement position had been meteoric, driven by a series of high-profile cases where she had taken on corruption regardless of party affiliation. The conflict between them had been simmering for months, ever since Walsh's Department of Justice had begun investigating irregularities in federal sentencing patterns that seemed to correlate suspiciously with the political affiliations of defendants. Several cases from Kane's court had attracted particular scrutiny, including the lenient sentence given to a former pharmaceutical executive whose company had donated heavily to conservative causes, while environmental activists received maximum penalties for far lesser offenses. The investigation had been conducted quietly, professionally, and according to strict departmental guidelines. Walsh had personally reviewed every file, consulted with ethics experts, and followed every protocol designed to ensure that judicial independence was respected while still maintaining accountability. But Kane had perceived the investigation as a personal attack, a deliberate attempt to undermine not just her authority, but the entire federal judiciary. The tension reached a breaking point when Kane issued an unprecedented public statement, criticizing the Department of Justice's political witch hunt against federal judges. The statement, released through her clerk's office, accused Walsh of weaponizing the Justice Department to intimidate judges who refused to bend to the current administration's radical agenda. It was an extraordinary breach of judicial protocol, one that sent shockwaves through the legal establishment and prompted calls for Kane's recusal from any cases involving federal prosecutors. Walsh's response had been measured and professional. Through a carefully worded press release, She reaffirmed the department's commitment to ensuring equal justice under law while respecting judicial independence. She emphasized that the investigation was ongoing and that all judges, regardless of their judicial philosophy, deserved fair treatment under established ethical guidelines. The statement was vintage Walsh, principled, precise, and absolutely devastating in its restraint. But Kane wasn't finished. Sources close to the judge revealed that she was furious about what she perceived as Walsh's condescending tone and implied criticism. Kane had spent decades building her reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who brooked no interference from anyone, and she wasn't about to let an upstart prosecutor with delusions of grandeur tarnish her legacy without a fight. The opportunity for retaliation came when CNN's Justice Watch program invited both women to participate in a special segment on judicial independence and executive authority. The show's producer, Marcus Chun, had built his reputation on booking high-profile guests who wouldn't normally appear together, creating television moments that defined political discourse for weeks afterward. When Kane accepted the invitation within hours of receiving it, Chun knew he had struck gold. Walsh's acceptance came more reluctantly, after considerable pressure from her communications team, who argued that declining would look like she was afraid to defend her positions publicly. The stage was set for what many observers predicted would be a civilized discussion between two accomplished legal minds. The CNN studios in Washington buzzed with anticipation as production assistants made final preparations for what promised to be appointment television. Chun had insisted on a live format, arguing that the authenticity of unscripted responses would better serve the public interest. Neither participant could edit their remarks or walk back statements that might prove politically damaging. Kane arrived at the studio 90 minutes before airtime, accompanied by a small entourage that included her longtime clerk, Robert Morrison, and her media consultant, Patricia Vale. She had spent the previous evening reviewing Walsh's public statements and court filings, looking for any inconsistencies or vulnerabilities that could be exploited during the discussion. Kane's preparation was meticulous, almost prosecutorial in its thoroughness, as she compiled what her team privately called the ammunition for the coming confrontation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Walsh arrived with her typical punctuality, exactly 30 minutes before the scheduled start time. Her preparation had been characteristically different from Kane's approach. Rather than focusing on attack strategies, Walsh had spent her time reviewing the constitutional principles and legal precedents that guided her department's actions. Her briefing book contained case law, ethics opinions, and historical examples of how previous attorneys general had balanced respect for judicial independence with their duty to ensure accountability. The green room conversations were stilted and formal, with both women maintaining the veneer of professional courtesy while their respective teams exchanged wary glances. Kane's media consultant whispered last-minute strategy adjustments, emphasizing the importance of appearing both authoritative and sympathetic to viewers who might see judicial independence as an abstract concept. Walsh's chief of staff, Maria Santos, reminded her to stay focused on facts and avoid personal attacks, no matter how provocative Kane might become. Host Rachel Morrison, a veteran journalist with 20 years of experience covering the intersection of law and politics, conducted the final technical checks while reviewing her carefully prepared questions. Morrison had built her reputation on fair but probing interviews that extracted newsworthy responses without descending into the gotcha journalism that had poisoned much of cable news discourse. She understood that the evening's program could significantly impact both participants' careers and wanted to ensure that viewers received substantive discussion rather than mere political theater. The studio itself had been configured to emphasize the gravity of the discussion. Both participants sat at a curved desk that positioned them at slight angles to each other, close enough for intimate conversation, but far enough apart to avoid any sense of confrontation. The lighting was designed to be flattering but not soft, creating an atmosphere of serious discourse. 3 cameras captured different angles, allowing the director to cut between shots that emphasized reactions and responses. As the final countdown began, the tension in the studio became palpable. Kane adjusted her posture slightly, assuming the authoritative bearing that had intimidated countless attorneys in her courtroom. Walsh remained characteristically calm, her hands folded simply in front of her, her expression reflecting the focused concentration that had made her legendary among prosecutors. The red light on the primary camera illuminated, signaling that millions of Americans were now watching what would unfold over the next hour. Morrison's opening was crisp and professional, introducing both participants and outlining the evening's focus on the delicate balance between judicial independence and executive oversight. She began with general questions about their respective roles and responsibilities, allowing both women to establish their credentials and positions before moving to more contentious territory. Kane's initial responses were measured and judicial, emphasizing the critical importance of an independent judiciary in protecting constitutional rights and maintaining the separation of powers. She spoke eloquently about the founder's vision of judges as a bulwark against both executive overreach and popular tyranny, positioning herself as a guardian of constitutional principles rather than a partisan actor. Her years on the bench had taught her how to project authority while appearing reasonable, and her early answers demonstrated that skill perfectly. Walsh's responses were equally professional, focusing on the Attorney General's constitutional duty to ensure that all government officials, including judges, adhered to the highest ethical standards. She carefully explained the department's investigation protocols, emphasizing the extensive safeguards designed to protect judicial independence while still maintaining accountability. Her tone was respectful but firm, clearly indicating that she would not be intimidated by judicial criticism of her office's legitimate oversight functions. The conversation remained civil through the first commercial break, with both participants adhering to the norms of professional discourse. Kane's team watched from the green room with satisfaction, believing their strategy of appearing reasonable while laying groundwork for later attacks was working perfectly. Walsh's advisors were similarly pleased with her performance, noting how effectively she had established the legal and constitutional foundations for her position. But as the program resumed, the atmosphere began to shift. Morrison's questions became more pointed, focusing specifically on the investigation into sentencing disparities and Kane's public criticism of the Department of Justice. Kane's responses became noticeably sharper, her judicial restraint giving way to barely contained irritation. She began using phrases like prosecutorial overreach and political intimidation, her voice taking on the edge that attorneys who had appeared before her knew signaled dangerous territory. Walsh maintained her professional demeanor, responding to each accusation with facts and legal precedents. When Kane suggested that the investigation was motivated by political bias, Walsh calmly cited the specific statistical analyses that had triggered the inquiry. When Kane claimed that judicial independence was under assault, Walsh quoted Supreme Court cases that established the legitimate scope of executive oversight. Her responses were devastating in their precision, each one undermining Kane's narrative while maintaining absolute respect for the judicial office. The turning point came when Morrison asked Kane directly about the pharmaceutical executive case that had drawn particular scrutiny. Kane's response was immediate and cutting, accusing Walsh of Monday morning quarterbacking judicial decisions and suggesting that the Attorney General lacked the experience and judgment to question the work of seasoned jurists. The attack was personal and unprofessional, a clear violation of the decorum that had governed the discussion to that point. Walsh's immediate response was to remain silent for several seconds, her expression reflecting neither anger nor surprise, but something closer to disappointment. When she finally spoke, her Her voice was steady and clear, cutting through the studio's tension like a surgical instrument. She didn't defend herself against Kane's personal attacks, but instead redirected the conversation to the victims of the sentencing. Disparities, the families whose lives had been destroyed by what appeared to be systematic bias in the application of justice. Kane realized too late that she had overplayed her hand. Her attack on Walsh's qualifications had revealed the personal animus driving her criticism, undermining her carefully constructed image as a defender of judicial independence. Morrison's follow-up questions focused on this shift in tone, asking Kane whether personal feelings about the Attorney General might be influencing her public statements about the investigation. The judge's response was to double down, launching into a lengthy critique of Walsh's entire career that included thinly veiled suggestions about her political motivations and professional competence. Kane's media consultant watched in horror. From the green room as her client systematically destroyed the sympathetic image they had worked so hard to create. The judge's attacks became increasingly personal and desperate, revealing a side of her personality that viewers found deeply troubling. Walsh's strategy throughout this barrage was to remain absolutely professional while allowing Kane to reveal her true character to the viewing audience. She responded to each attack with facts, statistics, and legal precedents, never raising her voice or responding in kind to the personal criticisms. Her calm professionalism created a stark contrast with Kane's increasingly erratic behavior, making the judge appear petty and vindictive, while Walsh seemed dignified and focused on her duty. The commercial break that followed was filled with frantic conversations between the participants and their advisors. Kane's team tried desperately to convince her to return to her earlier, more judicial tone, while Walsh's advisors simply encouraged her to continue doing exactly what she had been doing. Morrison used the break to review her remaining questions, realizing that the program had evolved beyond a policy discussion into something far more dramatic and consequential. When the cameras resumed rolling, Kane had apparently decided that her only path forward was total war. She began the segment with an unprecedented attack on Walsh's integrity, suggesting that the Attorney General was using her position to advance a personal agenda against conservative judges. The accusations were specific and damaging, designed to plant seeds of doubt about Walsh's motivations and competence that would grow in the minds of viewers long after the program ended. But Kane had fundamentally misunderstood her opponent. Walsh had built her career on prosecuting individuals who believed their positions made them untouchable, and she recognized Kane's tactics as variations on strategies she had encountered countless times in courtrooms across the country. The judge was trying to win through intimidation and personal destruction, tactics that might work in a courtroom where she held absolute authority, but were ineffective against someone who understood both the law and the power of truth. Walsh's response began quietly, almost conversationally, as she acknowledged the judge's obvious frustration with being investigated. But then she pivoted to a devastating recitation of the specific cases that had triggered the department's inquiry, reading directly from court transcripts that revealed the extent of the sentencing disparities. Her voice never rose, her tone never became confrontational, but the cumulative effect of the evidence she presented was overwhelming. Kane tried to interrupt several times, but Walsh continued speaking with the authority of someone who had spent months mastering every detail of the cases in question. She described families destroyed by excessive sentences for minor offenses, while wealthy defendants received probation for serious crimes. She cited specific examples of defendants whose only crime had been their inability to afford expensive legal representation, contrasted with others who had received inexplicably lenient treatment despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. The studio fell completely silent as Walsh concluded her presentation with a simple statement that would be replayed countless times over the following weeks. Looking directly into the camera rather than at Kane, she said that justice could not be a luxury available only to those who could afford it, and that anyone who used their position to create different standards of justice for different classes of people had violated the most fundamental principle of American law. Kane's face during Walsh's presentation went through a visible transformation, from confidence to confusion to barely contained rage. When Walsh finished speaking, the judge's response was immediate and catastrophic. She accused Walsh of lying, of fabricating evidence, and of conducting a political persecution disguised as an investigation. Her voice rose to nearly a shout as she demanded that Walsh retract her statements and apologize for what Kane characterized as a deliberate attempt to destroy her reputation. The confrontation reached its climax when Kane made the fatal mistake of threatening Walsh directly on live television. In a voice shaking with rage, she warned the Attorney General that judges have long memories and that Walsh would regret making an enemy of the federal judiciary. The threat was unmistakable, a clear suggestion that Kane would use her judicial position to retaliate against the Attorney General for conducting a legitimate investigation. Walsh's response to the threat was perhaps the most powerful moment in the history of televised political discourse. She remained absolutely still for several seconds, allowing the weight of Kane's words to settle over the studio and the viewing audience. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried a steel that made every word resonate with moral authority. She began by noting that threats and intimidation were exactly what her investigation had uncovered in Kane's courtroom, where defendants who couldn't afford expensive attorneys had learned to expect exactly the kind of retaliation the judge had just demonstrated on national television. Walsh then pivoted to a broader discussion of what judicial independence actually meant, explaining that it was designed to protect judges from political pressure, not to shield them from accountability when they violated their oaths of office. The Attorney General's final statement was delivered with a calm precision that made it impossible to ignore or dismiss. She looked directly at Kane and said that the American people deserved judges who understood that their authority came from the law, not from their personal preferences or political beliefs. She noted that real judicial independence required judges to be independent from their own biases and prejudices, not just from external political pressure. Kane's attempt to respond was incoherent, a rambling mixture of legal jargon and personal grievances that only reinforced the impression that she had lost control of both the discussion and herself. Morrison, recognizing that the program had reached a natural conclusion, thanked both participants and moved to closing credits as Kane continued speaking, apparently unaware that she was no longer on camera. The immediate aftermath in the studio was electric. Production assistants and camera operators stood frozen, recognizing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Kane's advisors rushed to damage control mode, already crafting statements that would try to explain away their client's performance. Walsh's team remained calm, understanding that their candidate had just delivered a masterclass in how to handle political intimidation with grace and strength. Kane left the studio immediately after the cameras stopped rolling, declining to speak with reporters who had gathered in anticipation of post-program interviews. Her rapid departure only reinforced the impression that she had suffered a decisive defeat, unable to face questions about her performance or her threats against the Attorney General. Her media consultant was already fielding calls from conservative commentators who were struggling to find ways to defend the judge's behavior. Walsh remained for nearly an hour after the program ended, speaking with reporters and answering questions about the broader implications of what viewers had just witnessed. Her responses were characteristically thoughtful and measured, focusing on the importance of maintaining public confidence in the justice system while ensuring that all officials, regardless of their position, remained accountable to the law. The reaction on social media was immediate and overwhelming. Video clips of Kane's threats and Walsh's responses spread across every platform, generating millions of views within hours of the program's conclusion. Legal experts across the political spectrum condemned Kane's behavior as unprecedented and unprofessional, while praising Walsh's composure under what amounted to a sustained personal attack. Editorial boards at major newspapers began preparing pieces for the following day's editions, with early drafts focusing on the broader questions raised by Kane's performance about judicial temperament and accountability. Law professors fielded calls from reporters seeking context for what many were already calling the most dramatic confrontation between judicial and executive authority in modern American history. The program had accomplished something that months of careful investigation and professional discourse had failed to achieve. In the span of 1 hour, Kane had revealed the exact character flaws and biases that had made her a subject of investigation. In the first place, her inability to handle professional criticism without resorting to personal attacks and threats had demonstrated precisely why judicial accountability was so essential to maintaining public confidence in the legal system. For Walsh, the evening represented both a personal victory and a professional vindication. Her calm professionalism under extreme pressure had demonstrated the leadership qualities that had made her one of the most respected prosecutors in the country. More importantly, her willingness to stand firm against judicial intimidation had shown that the rule of law was stronger than any individual's attempt to place themselves above accountability. The program's impact extended far beyond the immediate participants. Judges across the country found themselves fielding questions about Kane's behavior and its implications for judicial independence. Prosecutors and defense attorneys began reviewing cases from Kane's court with renewed scrutiny, looking for patterns that might support the department's investigation. Legal scholars started drafting articles about the proper boundaries between judicial independence and judicial accountability. In the weeks that followed, the confrontation would spawn congressional hearings, ethics investigations, and fundamental changes in how judicial conduct was monitored and addressed. But on that evening, as the studio lights dimmed and the participants went their separate ways, the most immediate impact was the recognition that the American people had witnessed something rare and important, a moment when principle triumphed over power, when truth proved stronger than intimidation, and when one person's courage in the face of threats reminded the nation that justice remained possible for those brave enough to demand it. The explosion of public reaction to the televised confrontation between Judge Miranda Kane and Attorney General Sarah Walsh created seismic shifts throughout the corridors of power in Washington. By dawn the following morning, the video clips had been viewed over 50 million times across all social media platforms, with hashtags like judicial accountability and Walsh Stand Strong trending globally. Cable news networks abandoned their regular programming schedules to provide wall-to-wall coverage of what commentators were already calling the most significant judicial controversy in decades. The White House found itself in an unprecedented position, forced to navigate between supporting their Attorney General and avoiding the appearance of interfering with judicial independence. Press Secretary James Rodriguez faced a hostile briefing room filled with reporters demanding to know whether the administration would take action against Judge Kane's threats. Rodriguez's carefully prepared statements emphasized the administration's respect for both judicial independence and the rule of law, while avoiding any direct criticism of Kane's behavior that might be interpreted as executive interference with the judiciary. Behind closed doors, the president's senior advisors engaged in heated debates about how to respond to the crisis. Chief of Staff Margaret Thompson argued for a strong statement supporting Walsh and condemning judicial intimidation, while White House counsel David Kim warned that any presidential involvement could be portrayed as an attack on judicial independence. The president ultimately decided to remain publicly silent, while privately expressing full confidence in Walsh's handling of the investigation. The reaction from Congress was swift and bipartisan in its condemnation of Kane's behavior. Senator Elizabeth Warren, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, announced within hours of the program's conclusion that her committee would hold emergency hearings on judicial conduct and accountability. Warren's statement emphasized that No judge, regardless of their political philosophy, had the right to threaten executive branch officials for performing their constitutional duties. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, typically protective of conservative judicial appointees, found himself in the difficult position of defending the indefensible. His initial statement called for cooler heads to prevail and urged both sides to lower the temperature of their rhetoric. The tepid response drew immediate criticism from members of his own caucus, who recognized that Kane's behavior had crossed lines that could not be defended on partisan grounds. The legal community's response was even more dramatic. The American Bar Association's president, Catherine Mueller, issued an unprecedented statement calling Kane's threats a fundamental violation of judicial ethics and demanding an immediate investigation by the appropriate disciplinary authorities. Legal scholars from across the political spectrum condemned Kane's behavior in op-eds and television appearances, with many arguing that her threats constituted grounds for impeachment. Federal judges found themselves in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position, forced to choose between defending a colleague and maintaining the integrity of the judiciary. Many chose silence, recognizing that any defense of Kane's behavior would be politically and professionally toxic. Others issued carefully worded statements emphasizing their commitment to judicial independence while distancing themselves from Kane's specific actions. The most significant response came from Chief Justice Roberts, who broke with tradition by issuing a public statement on the controversy. Roberts' brief but pointed remarks emphasized that judicial independence required judges to be independent from their own prejudices and political preferences, not just from external pressure. While he did not mention Kane by name, the statement was widely interpreted as a rebuke of her behavior and a signal that the Supreme Court would not tolerate judicial intimidation of executive branch officials. Within the Department of Justice, Walsh found herself dealing with an outpouring of support from career prosecutors and staff attorneys who had watched her performance with admiration and pride. Internal emails flooded the system with messages praising her composure and principled stance against judicial bullying. The U.S. attorneys from across the country reached out personally to express their support and to offer assistance with the ongoing investigation. The investigation itself took on new urgency and significance following Kane's televised threats. What had begun as a routine review of sentencing patterns now carried the weight of a constitutional crisis, with the entire legal system watching to see whether judicial accountability would prevail over judicial intimidation. Walsh assigned additional resources to the investigation, bringing in specialists in judicial ethics and constitutional law to ensure that every aspect of Kane's conduct received thorough scrutiny. Media coverage of the controversy dominated news cycles for weeks, with journalists diving deep into Kane's judicial record and finding a pattern of behavior that supported Walsh's investigation. Court transcripts revealed numerous instances where Kane had made disparaging comments about defendants who couldn't afford private counsel, while showing remarkable leniency toward wealthy defendants facing similar charges. Former clerks, speaking anonymously, described a judge who viewed her courtroom as a personal fiefdom where her political preferences took precedence over legal precedent. The pharmaceutical executive case that had been mentioned during the televised confrontation became a focal point of media attention. Investigative reporters uncovered a complex web of relationships between the executive's company, conservative advocacy groups, and Kane's own financial interests. While no direct corruption was proven, the pattern of connections raised serious questions about conflicts of interest that Kane had failed to disclose. Environmental activists who had received harsh sentences in Kane's court began speaking publicly about their experiences, describing a judge who seemed personally offended by their political beliefs rather than focused on the legal merits of their cases. Their stories, combined with court transcripts and sentencing data, painted a picture of systematic bias that went far beyond normal judicial discretion. The contrast with Walsh's handling of the controversy only enhanced her reputation as a principled leader willing to stand up to intimidation. Her refusal to back down in the face of Kane's threats resonated with prosecutors, judges, and legal scholars who understood the courage required to challenge a sitting federal judge. Law schools began using the confrontation as a case study in legal ethics and professional responsibility, with Walsh's performance serving as a model of how to maintain dignity while defending constitutional principles. Kane's attempts at damage control proved spectacularly unsuccessful. Her initial statement, released through her clerk's office, claimed that her remarks had been taken out of context and that she had never intended to threaten the Attorney General. The explanation satisfied no one, particularly since the video evidence clearly showed Kane making explicit threats about judicial retaliation. Subsequent statements only made her situation worse, with each attempt at clarification revealing additional evidence of bias and unprofessional conduct. Conservative legal organizations found themselves in an impossible position, torn between their usual support for judicial independence and their recognition that Kane's behavior was indefensible. Some chose to remain silent, while others issued statements supporting judicial independence in general terms, while avoiding any specific defense of Kane's actions. The few organizations that attempted to defend Kane found themselves isolated and facing criticism from their own members. The Federal Bureau of Investigation quietly began its own review of Kane's conduct, focusing on potential violations of federal law related to official misconduct and abuse of power. While the investigation remained confidential, word of its existence leaked to the media, further intensifying pressure on Kane and her supporters. The FBI's involvement transformed the controversy from a matter of judicial ethics into a potential criminal case, raising the stakes for everyone involved. Kane's courtroom became a focus of intense scrutiny, with journalists and legal observers attending hearings to document her behavior and demeanor. Court watchers reported that Kane appeared increasingly agitated and defensive, frequently making remarks that seemed designed to justify her past decisions, rather than address the legal issues before her. Her interactions with attorneys became noticeably more hostile, particularly toward prosecutors and defense attorneys representing indigent defendants. The Judicial Conduct Committee, responsible for investigating ethics violations against federal judges, found itself overwhelmed with complaints and demands for action. The committee, traditionally operating in secrecy and moving at a glacial pace, faced unprecedented public pressure to act quickly and decisively. Committee members privately acknowledged that Kane's case presented the most serious challenge to judicial integrity they had encountered in their careers. Legal experts began debating the precedent that Kane's case would set for future judicial accountability. Some argued that allowing her behavior to go unpunished would signal to other judges that they could intimidate executive branch officials with impunity. Others warned that too aggressive a response could undermine legitimate judicial independence and create a chilling effect on judges, who needed to make difficult decisions without fear of political retaliation. The controversy also sparked a broader national conversation about the role of judges in American democracy and the proper boundaries of judicial authority. Polling data showed that public confidence in the judiciary had declined significantly following Kane's performance, with many Americans expressing concern about whether judges were applying the law fairly regardless of defendants' political beliefs or economic status. Academic conferences and legal symposiums began organizing panels on judicial accountability and the lessons of the Kane controversy. Law review articles were commissioned to examine the constitutional and ethical issues raised by the case, with scholars from across the political spectrum contributing to what became a comprehensive examination of judicial conduct and oversight. International observers watched the controversy with intense interest, recognizing that the American response would influence global discussions about judicial independence and accountability. Legal systems around the world grappled with similar tensions between protecting judicial independence and ensuring judicial responsibility, making Kane's case a test case for democratic governance more broadly. The impact on Kane's personal life became increasingly apparent as the controversy continued to dominate headlines. Social media harassment forced her to hire private security, while old friends and colleagues distanced themselves from someone who had become radioactive in legal circles. Her reputation, built over decades of judicial service, disintegrated in a matter of weeks as more evidence of bias and unprofessional conduct emerged. Walsh, meanwhile, found herself elevated to a new level of national prominence, with speculation beginning about her potential future in politics or on the Supreme Court. Her handling of the Kane controversy had demonstrated exactly the kind of principled leadership that many Americans were seeking in their public officials. Speaking invitations poured in from law schools, bar associations, and civic organizations, eager to hear from someone who had stood up to judicial intimidation with such grace and effectiveness. The Department of Justice's investigation expanded to include other judges whose sentencing patterns showed similar disparities, transforming Kane's individual case into a systematic review of judicial conduct across multiple districts. The expanded investigation revealed that Kane's behavior, while extreme, was part of a broader pattern of bias that affected courts throughout the federal system. Statistical analyses showed significant disparities in sentencing based on defendants' race, economic status, and political affiliations, providing empirical support for Walsh's decision to pursue the investigation. Professional organizations representing court personnel began coming forward with additional evidence of Kane's inappropriate behavior. Court reporters, clerks, and bailiffs described a work environment where Kane's political preferences influenced everything from scheduling decisions to the treatment of attorneys and litigants. Their accounts painted a picture of a judge who had lost sight of her role as an impartial arbiter of the law and has instead become an advocate for her own political agenda. The financial costs of the controversy continued to mount as Kane's legal team expanded to include specialists in criminal defense and judicial ethics. Her legal bills, funded partly through judicial insurance programs, became a source of additional controversy as taxpayers questioned whether they should bear the cost of defending a judge who had clearly violated her oath of office. Some members of Congress began calling for changes to judicial insurance programs to prevent public funding of defenses against misconduct charges. Kane's family members found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight, with reporters investigating her personal relationships and financial dealings for additional evidence of bias or corruption. The stress of the constant scrutiny took a visible toll on Kane's appearance and demeanor, with court observers noting that she appeared increasingly haggard and defensive during public appearances. The controversy also had significant implications for pending cases in Kane's court, with defense attorneys filing motions for recusal based on her demonstrated bias and unprofessional conduct. Several cases were reassigned to other judges, while others faced lengthy delays as the legal system grappled with how to handle cases that might have been tainted by Kane's conduct. The administrative burden of addressing these issues added to the costs and complications of the controversy. Legal ethics professors began using Kane's case as a teaching tool, developing hypothetical scenarios based on her conduct to help law students understand the importance of judicial impartiality and professional responsibility. The case became a standard reference point for discussions of judicial ethics, serving as a cautionary tale about what happens when judges allow personal and political preferences to override their professional obligations. The broader implications of the controversy extended beyond the legal system to questions about democratic accountability and the rule of law. Political scientists and constitutional scholars examined how Kane's behavior reflected broader trends in the politicization of the judiciary and the erosion of institutional norms. Their analyses contributed to a growing body of scholarship on democratic governance, and the challenges facing American institutions in an era of intense polarization. As the investigation continued and pressure mounted for decisive action, Kane's position became increasingly untenable. Her attempts to rally support among conservative legal organizations had largely failed, while her behavior had alienated potential allies who might have defended her on principle. A combination of legal, political, and professional pressure created a perfect storm that made her continued service on the federal bench practically impossible. The stage was set for the final act of the drama, as formal disciplinary proceedings began and criminal investigations intensified. The question was no longer whether Kane would face consequences for her actions, but rather what form those consequences would take and what precedent they would set for future cases of judicial misconduct. The entire legal system held its breath, as the machinery of justice slowly but inexorably moved toward a reckoning that would define the boundaries of judicial accountability for generations to come. The marble steps of the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia had never witnessed a scene quite like the one unfolding on this crisp October morning. Media vans lined the street for 3 blocks in each direction, their satellite dishes reaching toward an overcast sky that seemed to mirror the gravity of the proceedings about to begin inside. Protesters had gathered behind police barricades, their signs reflecting the deep divisions that Judge Miranda Kane's case had exposed within American society. Some demanded her immediate removal from the bench, while others proclaimed their support for judicial independence, though even Kane's supporters seemed subdued and uncertain in the face of mounting evidence against her. Attorney General Sarah Walsh stepped from her official vehicle with the same composed demeanor that had served her so well during the televised confrontation that had started this avalanche of consequences. Her dark blue suit was perfectly tailored, her bearing confident but not arrogant, reflecting someone who understood the historic nature of the moment while remaining focused on the constitutional principles at stake. She carried a slim leather briefcase containing months of meticulous investigation, witness statements, and documentary evidence that would finally bring the full scope of Kane's misconduct into the harsh light of judicial scrutiny. The proceedings were unlike anything in modern judicial history. Kane faced a formal disciplinary hearing before a panel of senior federal judges, a process that could result in anything from a reprimand to removal from the bench. The hearing room had been configured to accommodate the unprecedented media attention, with designated areas for journalists from around the world who had come to witness what many legal scholars were calling a defining moment for American justice. Judge Robert Harrison, the Chief Judge of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, presided over the 3-judge panel tasked with determining Kane's fate. Harrison's reputation for fairness and thorough legal analysis had made him the obvious choice to lead proceedings that everyone understood would be scrutinized for generations. Flanking him were Judge Patricia Chun, known for her expertise in judicial ethics, and Judge Michael Rodriguez, whose background in constitutional law provided essential perspective on the separation of powers issues raised by the case. Kane entered the hearing room flanked by a team of attorneys led by prominent criminal defense lawyer Thomas Brennan, whose reputation for aggressive advocacy had made him a natural choice for a client facing career-ending allegations. Brennan's strategy was clear from his opening statement, which portrayed Kane as a victim of political persecution who had been targeted for her conservative judicial philosophy rather than any actual misconduct. He argued that the investigation represented an unprecedented attack on judicial independence that threatened the constitutional separation of powers. But as Walsh began presenting her evidence, the weakness of Brennan's strategy became apparent. The Attorney General had compiled a devastating case that went far beyond political differences to document a pattern of bias, so systematic and pervasive that it could not be explained by legitimate judicial discretion. Her presentation was methodical and comprehensive, building from statistical analyses of sentencing patterns to specific examples of misconduct that revealed the depth of Kane's violations of judicial ethics. The first phase of Walsh's presentation focused on the pharmaceutical executive case that had become a symbol of Kane's bias. Through court transcripts, financial records, and witness testimony, Walsh demonstrated that Kane had received substantial donations to her favorite charities, from organizations connected to the pharmaceutical company, donations that had never been disclosed despite clear ethical requirements. The evidence showed that Kane had been aware of these connections when she imposed an unusually lenient sentence on the executive, yet had failed to recuse herself or even acknowledge the potential conflict of interest. More damaging still were the recorded conversations between Kane and the pharmaceutical company's attorneys, obtained through court-authorized surveillance that had been triggered by the Justice Department's investigation. In these recordings, Kane could be heard expressing personal animosity toward environmental activists and suggesting that harsh sentences would send a message to others who might challenge corporate interests. The recordings revealed a judge who had abandoned any pretense of impartiality in favor of advancing her personal and political agenda. The environmental activists who had faced Kane's harsh sentences testified about their experiences in her courtroom, describing a judge who seemed personally offended by their political beliefs rather than focused on the legal merits of their cases. Their testimony was particularly powerful because it came from defendants across the political spectrum, including some whose only crime had been peaceful protest on environmental issues. The consistency of their accounts painted a picture of a judge who had systematically abused her authority to punish political dissent. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony from Kane's former law clerks, several of whom had agreed to testify under grants of immunity from prosecution. These young attorneys described the chamber's environment where Kane routinely made disparaging comments about defendants based on their race, economic status, and political beliefs. They testified that Kane had instructed them to research defendants' political affiliations and charitable contributions, information that she then used to influence her sentencing decisions. One particularly compelling witness was former clerk Amanda Foster, who had kept detailed notes of Kane's comments because she had been so troubled by what she witnessed. Foster's testimony included specific quotes from Kane about how these people needed to learn their place and how lenient sentences for wealthy defendants were justified because they contributed more to society than poor defendants. The clinical detail of Foster's testimony left the hearing room in stunned silence, with even Kane's attorneys appearing shaken by the revelations. The financial investigation component of Walsh's case revealed a web of relationships that extended far beyond the pharmaceutical case. Kane had received substantial benefits from conservative legal organizations, including paid speaking engagements, luxury vacations, and gifts that had never been properly disclosed. While these benefits might not have constituted outright bribery, they clearly violated federal ethics requirements and created the appearance of impropriety that undermined public confidence in the judicial system. Walsh's presentation also included evidence of Kane's attempts to obstruct the investigation, including her efforts to intimidate witnesses and her public threats against the Attorney General herself. The televised confrontation that had started the entire controversy was presented as the culmination of a pattern of intimidation and retaliation that Kane had used throughout her judicial career to silence criticism and avoid accountability. The international implications of the case were highlighted through testimony from foreign legal experts who explained how Kane's behavior had damaged America's reputation as a model for judicial integrity. These witnesses described how authoritarian governments around the world had cited Kane's case as evidence that American criticism of their judicial systems was hypocritical, undermining decades of diplomatic efforts to promote rule of law globally. Kane's defense team struggled to respond to the overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Brennan's strategy of portraying the investigation as political persecution fell apart when confronted with recorded conversations and documentary evidence that revealed Kane's own political motivations. His attempts to justify Kane's behavior as legitimate judicial discretion were undermined by the systematic nature of the bias and the clear violation of ethical requirements regarding disclosure and recusal. The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when Kane herself took the stand in her own defense. Her testimony was a disaster that revealed the same arrogance and lack of accountability that had characterized her behavior throughout the controversy. Under cross-examination by Walsh, Kane continued to justify her actions and deny any wrongdoing, even when confronted with her own recorded statements. Her performance on the stand confirmed every criticism that had been made about her fitness for judicial office. Kane's attempt to portray herself as a victim of political persecution was undermined by her own words and actions. When Walsh asked her to explain specific instances of bias documented in the evidence, Kane's responses revealed a judge who genuinely believed that her personal and political preferences justified differential treatment of defendants. Her inability to acknowledge even the possibility that she had acted inappropriately demonstrated a fundamental lack of understanding of judicial ethics and responsibility. The questioning became particularly intense when Walsh focused on Kane's threats against the Attorney General and other Justice Department officials. Kane's attempts to minimize these threats as mere expressions of frustration were unconvincing, particularly given the documented pattern of retaliation against anyone who had challenged her authority. Her testimony revealed someone who viewed criticism as an attack on her person, rather than a legitimate exercise of oversight responsibility. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that Kane had lost the support of even her most stalwart defenders. Conservative legal organizations that had initially rallied to her defense began distancing themselves as the evidence mounted. Several prominent conservative judges issued statements emphasizing their commitment to judicial integrity and their recognition that Kane's behavior was indefensible regardless of political philosophy. The broader legal community watched the proceedings with intense interest, recognizing that the panel's decision would set important precedents for judicial accountability and the boundaries of acceptable judicial behavior. Law schools suspended regular classes to allow students to observe the hearings, while bar associations organized viewing parties and discussion sessions to help their members understand the implications of the case. International media coverage of the hearing was extensive, with legal experts from around the world providing commentary on the American judicial system's ability to police itself. The proceedings were seen as a test of American democratic institutions and their capacity for self-correction when faced with serious misconduct by high-ranking officials. The panel's deliberations lasted 3 days, during which time speculation about the outcome dominated news coverage and social media discussions. Legal experts debated the various sanctions available to the panel, ranging from censure to removal from office, while attempting to predict how the judges would balance concerns about judicial independence against the need for accountability. When the panel reconvened to announce their decision, the hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent courtrooms. Judge Harrison's reading of the panel's findings was methodical and comprehensive, addressing each allegation against Kane with careful legal analysis and devastating conclusions about her fitness for judicial office. The panel found that Kane had violated numerous canons of judicial ethics through her biased sentencing practices, failure to disclose financial conflicts of interest, and attempts to intimidate Justice Department officials. Harrison's statement emphasized that judicial independence required judges to be independent from their own prejudices and political preferences, not just from external pressure. The panel concluded that Kane's behavior had fundamentally undermined public confidence in the judiciary and constituted grounds for removal from office. The formal announcement of Kane's removal from the federal bench sent shockwaves through the legal community and beyond. The decision marked the first time in decades that a federal judge had been removed for misconduct, setting a powerful precedent for judicial accountability. Kane's immediate appeals to higher courts were widely expected to fail, given the overwhelming evidence against her and the careful legal analysis provided by the disciplinary panel. Kane's public statement following the decision was defiant and unrepentant, maintaining her innocence and portraying the proceedings as a political witch hunt. Her response only reinforced the panel's conclusions about her unfitness for judicial office and her fundamental misunderstanding of judicial ethics and responsibility. The statement was widely criticized even by her former supporters, who recognized that it demonstrated exactly the kind of arrogance and lack of accountability that had led to her downfall. Walsh's response to the decision was characteristically measured and professional, emphasizing the importance of maintaining public confidence in the judicial system while respecting the separation of powers. Her statement focused on the broader lessons of the case and the need for continued vigilance in ensuring that all public officials, regardless of their position, remained accountable to the law and the Constitution. The immediate aftermath of the decision saw renewed calls for comprehensive reform of judicial oversight mechanisms. Members of Congress from both parties introduced legislation designed to strengthen ethical requirements for federal judges and improve the processes for investigating and addressing judicial misconduct. The reforms were widely supported by legal organizations and civil rights groups that had been galvanized by Kane's case. The impact on pending cases in Kane's former court was significant, with dozens of sentences being reviewed for potential bias and several defendants receiving new hearings before different judges. The process of addressing these cases highlighted the broader damage that judicial misconduct could inflict on the legal system and the lives of individual defendants who had been denied fair treatment. Kane's removal also had important implications for the judicial nomination process, with senators from both parties demanding enhanced vetting procedures to prevent similar problems in the future. The case became a reference point for discussions about judicial qualifications and the importance of character and integrity, in addition to legal expertise and political philosophy. The international reaction to Kane's removal was generally positive, with foreign legal experts praising the American judicial system's capacity for self-correction and accountability. The decision helped restore some of the damage to America's reputation that Kane's behavior had caused, demonstrating that no one was above the law in the American system of justice. Academic institutions began incorporating the Kane case into their curricula as a case study in judicial ethics and the importance of institutional accountability. Law schools developed simulation exercises based on the case to help students understand the practical and ethical challenges facing judges and the mechanisms available for addressing judicial misconduct. The long-term implications of the case extended beyond the immediate issues of judicial accountability to broader questions about democratic governance and institutional integrity. Political scientists and constitutional scholars examined how Kane's behavior reflected broader trends in the politicization of American institutions and the challenges facing democratic systems in an era of intense polarization. Walsh's role in the case significantly enhanced her national profile and reputation as a principled leader willing to take on powerful interests in defense of constitutional principles. Speculation about her future career options intensified, with many observers suggesting that her handling of the Kane case had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that the country needed in its highest offices. The case also had important implications for the relationship between the executive and judicial branches of government, clarifying the boundaries of legitimate oversight while maintaining respect for judicial independence. The precedent established by Kane's removal provided important guidance for future cases where judicial conduct might require executive branch investigation and action. Professional organizations representing court personnel used the case as an opportunity to establish better protections for employees who might witness judicial misconduct. New policies were implemented to encourage reporting of ethical violations while protecting whistleblowers from retaliation, recognizing that court staff often had the best opportunity to observe judicial behavior that might require investigation. The financial costs of the Kane case, including the investigation, hearing, and appeals process, sparked discussions about how to fund judicial accountability mechanisms without creating perverse incentives for frivolous complaints. Reform proposals included dedicated funding streams for judicial oversight and improved procedures for expediting legitimate misconduct cases while filtering out politically motivated attacks. Kane's personal aftermath was swift and decisive. Her law license was suspended pending disciplinary proceedings by the state bar, effectively ending any possibility of returning to legal practice. Her attempts to maintain a public profile through media appearances and speaking engagements were largely unsuccessful, as organizations distanced themselves from someone who had become synonymous with judicial corruption and abuse of power. The broader legacy of the Kane case was the establishment of new standards for judicial accountability that balanced the need for judicial independence with the equally important need for ethical behavior and public accountability. The case demonstrated that the American legal system, despite its flaws and challenges, retained the capacity for self-correction when faced with serious misconduct by high-ranking officials. Walsh's principled stance throughout the controversy became a model for how public officials should respond to intimidation and political pressure. Her willingness to pursue the investigation despite threats and criticism demonstrated the kind of courage and integrity that effective democratic governance required. Her example inspired other prosecutors and public officials to take similar stands against corruption and abuse of power, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate case. The educational impact of the case was perhaps its most important long-term contribution to American democracy. The proceedings provided a real-world demonstration of constitutional principles in action, showing how the system of checks and balances was designed to prevent any individual or institution from becoming too powerful. Students, legal professionals, and ordinary citizens gained a deeper understanding of how democratic institutions were supposed to function and what happened when they failed to meet their responsibilities. As the immediate crisis passed and the legal system adapted to the new precedents established by Kane's removal, the broader lessons of the case continued to resonate throughout American society. The controversy had revealed both the fragility and the resilience of democratic institutions, showing how quickly public confidence could be undermined by misconduct, but also how effectively the system could respond when confronted with clear evidence of wrongdoing. The case ultimately served as a powerful reminder that the rule of law in a democracy depended not on the perfection of its institutions, but on their willingness to hold themselves accountable when they failed to meet their responsibilities. Kane's removal demonstrated that no one, regardless of their position or political connections, was above the law, while Walsh's principled leadership showed that individual courage and integrity could still triumph over institutional inertia and political calculation. Years later, legal historians would mark the Kane case as a turning point in American judicial accountability, a moment when the legal system demonstrated its capacity for renewal and reform in the face of serious challenges to its integrity. The precedents established by the case would guide future generations of judges, prosecutors, and public officials in understanding their responsibilities to the Constitution and the American people they served. The reverberations from Judge Miranda Kane's historic removal continued to reshape the American legal landscape in ways that few could have anticipated when Attorney General Sarah Walsh first launched her investigation into judicial bias. 3 months after the disciplinary panel's devastating decision, the nation found itself grappling with fundamental questions about justice, accountability, and the delicate balance between institutional independence and democratic oversight that would define the next generation of American jurisprudence. Within the halls of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts convened an unprecedented series of closed-door meetings with the chief judges of all circuit courts, recognizing that Kane's case had exposed systemic weaknesses in judicial oversight that could no longer be ignored. The meetings, while confidential, resulted in the most comprehensive review of judicial conduct standards in 50 years, with new protocols for financial disclosure, conflict identification, and ethical training that would affect every federal judge in the country. The ripple effects extended far beyond the federal courthouse system. State judicial systems across the nation began implementing similar reforms, recognizing that public confidence in the judiciary could not be restored through federal action alone. The Conference of Chief Justices, representing the highest courts in all 50 states, unanimously adopted new model codes of judicial conduct based largely on the lessons learned from Kane's spectacular fall from grace. Attorney General Walsh found herself at the center of a transformation that extended far beyond her original investigation. The success of her principled stand against judicial intimidation had made her one of the most respected figures in American law enforcement, but it had also placed enormous pressure on her to continue pushing for systemic reform. Speaking at the American Bar Association's annual convention, Walsh outlined her vision for a justice system that truly lived up to its promise of equal treatment under law, regardless of a defendant's wealth, political beliefs, or social status. Her speech, delivered to a standing ovation from thousands of legal professionals, became a rallying cry for reform-minded prosecutors and judges across the country. Walsh spoke passionately about the need to restore public trust in legal institutions through transparency, accountability, and a renewed commitment to the fundamental principle that justice must be blind to everything except the facts and the law. Her words resonated not just with legal professionals, but with ordinary Americans who had watched the Kane proceedings and demanded better from their public servants. The political implications of Walsh's enhanced stature were impossible to ignore. Speculation about her potential candidacy for higher office intensified, with political analysts from both parties acknowledging that her handling of the Kane case had demonstrated exactly the kind of principled leadership that voters were seeking. While Walsh consistently declined to discuss her political future, focusing instead on her duties as Attorney General, the groundswell of support for her potential candidacy continued to grow. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation into Kane's conduct had yielded additional charges that went far beyond the judicial misconduct that had led to her removal from the bench. Federal prosecutors, working under Walsh's supervision, had uncovered evidence of tax evasion, bribery, and conspiracy that painted a picture of corruption far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. The charges carried potential prison sentences that could keep Kane behind bars for decades, transforming her from a disgraced former judge into a defendant facing the very system she had corrupted. Kane's legal team, led by the increasingly desperate Thomas Brennan, found themselves fighting a losing battle against overwhelming evidence and a client whose continued denials and attacks on her accusers only made her situation worse. Brennan's attempts to negotiate a plea agreement were complicated by Kane's refusal to accept responsibility for her actions, her continued insistence that she had been the victim of a political conspiracy, and her apparent inability to understand the gravity of her situation. The broader legal community watched Kane's criminal prosecution with intense interest, recognizing that the outcome would send a powerful message about accountability for judicial corruption. Law enforcement officials at all levels understood that Kane's case would either reinforce the principle that no one was above the law or create dangerous precedents that could embolden future misconduct by powerful officials. The educational impact of the Kane case extended far beyond law schools and professional organizations. High schools across the country began incorporating the case into their civics curricula, using it as a real-world example of how democratic institutions were supposed to function when faced with corruption and abuse of power. Students engaged in mock trials and debates based on the case, gaining practical understanding of constitutional principles and the importance of institutional accountability. University scholars from disciplines ranging from political science to sociology began studying the case as a window into broader questions about power, corruption, and democratic governance. Their research revealed patterns of behavior that extended beyond Kane's individual misconduct to systemic issues within the federal judiciary that had enabled her corruption to flourish unchecked for years. International legal experts continued to follow the case closely, recognizing its significance for global discussions about judicial independence and accountability. The American response to Kane's misconduct was being studied by legal reformers in countries around the world who were grappling with similar challenges in their own judicial systems. The case had become a test case for democratic accountability that would influence legal reforms far beyond American borders. The financial costs of addressing Kane's misconduct continued to mount as courts across the country dealt with the aftermath of her biased decisions. Hundreds of cases required review, with many defendants seeking new trials or sentence modifications based on evidence of judicial bias. The process of addressing these cases highlighted the enormous cost that judicial corruption imposed not just on individual defendants, but on the entire legal system. Civil rights organizations that had long advocated for judicial accountability found themselves vindicated by the Kane case, but also faced with new challenges as they worked to ensure that the reforms implemented in response to her misconduct would be meaningful and lasting. These organizations played crucial roles in monitoring the implementation of new oversight mechanisms and advocating for continued vigilance against judicial bias and corruption. The media coverage of Kane's ongoing legal troubles revealed new details about her misconduct that had not been fully explored during the disciplinary proceedings. Investigative journalists uncovered additional financial irregularities, documented patterns of bias that extended back decades, and revealed a network of relationships between Kane and special interests that raised troubling questions about how such corruption could have persisted for so long without detection. Professional organizations representing court personnel used the Kane case as an opportunity to implement comprehensive reforms designed to protect employees who might witness judicial misconduct. New whistleblower protections, anonymous reporting mechanisms, and anti-retaliation policies were established to encourage reporting of ethical violations, while protecting those brave enough to come forward with evidence of wrongdoing. The technology industry became involved in the reform efforts, developing new systems for monitoring judicial conduct and identifying potential patterns of bias or corruption. These technological solutions, while controversial among some who worried about privacy and judicial independence, offered promising tools for detecting problems before they reached the level of Kane's systematic corruption. Legal aid organizations that served indigent defendants found themselves with new resources and support as the Kane case highlighted the particular vulnerability of poor defendants to judicial bias. The systematic discrimination that Kane had practiced against defendants who couldn't afford private counsel had galvanized support for legal aid programs and public defender offices that served as the only protection for society's most vulnerable members. The impact on judicial nominations became apparent as the Senate began considering new appointments to fill vacancies on federal courts. Senators from both parties insisted on enhanced vetting procedures, more detailed financial disclosures, and comprehensive ethical training for all nominees. The confirmation process, already contentious, became even more rigorous as lawmakers sought to prevent future Kane-like scandals. Walsh's Department of Justice implemented new protocols for investigating judicial misconduct, creating specialized units with expertise in judicial ethics and constitutional law. These units were tasked with developing proactive monitoring systems that could identify potential problems before they reached crisis levels, learning from the failures that had allowed Kane's corruption to persist for so long. The psychological Impact of the case on other federal judges was significant, with many reporting increased anxiety about their own conduct and decision-making processes. Judicial education programs were expanded to help judges understand their ethical obligations and provide guidance on avoiding conflicts of interest and maintaining appropriate professional behavior. Kane's former colleagues on the federal bench found themselves under intense scrutiny as journalists and investigators searched for evidence of similar misconduct. While most judges appeared to have maintained appropriate ethical standards, the investigation revealed a culture of complacency and mutual protection that had enabled Kane's behavior to continue unchecked. The case also sparked important discussions about the role of money in the judicial system, from campaign contributions to judicial elections in state systems to the influence of special interest groups on federal judicial nominations. Reform advocates used Kane's case as evidence for the need to reduce the influence of private money on judicial decision-making at all levels. Community organizations across the country organized forums and discussions about the Kane case, recognizing its importance for civic education and democratic engagement. These grassroots efforts helped ordinary citizens understand the importance of judicial accountability and their role in demanding better from their public institutions. The international legal community continued to watch the American response to Kane's misconduct, with many foreign observers noting the contrast between the thorough investigation and accountability measures taken in the United States and the lack of similar mechanisms in their own countries. The case became a model for judicial accountability that influenced legal reforms around the world. As Kane's criminal trial approached, prosecutors worked to ensure that the case would serve as both an individual reckoning for her crimes and a broader statement about the importance of judicial integrity. The trial promised to reveal even more details about the extent of her corruption and the damage it had inflicted on countless defendants and their families. Walsh's leadership throughout the crisis had transformed her from a respected but relatively unknown prosecutor into a national figure whose principled stands and effective leadership had restored faith in American institutions. Her example inspired a new generation of prosecutors and public servants who understood that real leadership required courage, integrity, and a willingness to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The legacy of the Kane case would ultimately be measured not just by the individual accountability it achieved, but by the systematic reforms it inspired and the renewed commitment to justice it fostered throughout the American legal system. The case had demonstrated both the fragility of democratic institutions and their capacity for renewal when confronted by principled leadership and public demand for accountability. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.